Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Coram Graves Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking the question of what if Russia had joined NATO? So as with always, we're going to go through some of the history of this and explain some of the different nuances of it and stuff, right? Because this is something which a lot of people might think on the face of it is just a completely ridiculous thing in terms of especially what's going on at the moment with regard to the recent conflict in Russia and Ukraine. But this was actually a lot more of a possibility than one might first think. Yeah, so that's what we're kind of going to look into now. But before we do all that, don't forget obviously to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. We have a whole bunch of different videos about a whole different bunch of topics, and share if you if you have any friends at all. Like, I'm not sure, some people must have some friends, and yeah, like, share with them because like that would really help out the channel, and it also will help you out as well. You'll get a lot of social credit, your social credit score will go through the roof. So but anyway, that being said, let's kind of dive into the video. So first of all, we have to start off with the history of the Cold War, right? So in 1949, NATO was founded, which was pretty much the Western Alliance. This is America, Canada, and like the countries in Western Europe. And this was basically formed as a defensive bloc. Now, we all knew, well, everyone knew at that time, that it was a defensive bloc against the threat of the Soviet Union, right? However, they couldn't explicitly say that. They had to just say it's a defensive alliance, right? So to basically poke holes in this, right, and to basically play the West in this kind of regard, right, Foreign Minister Molotov, he basically did a very, very clever thing, which is that he basically applied for the USSR to join NATO. Now, this was a win-win for the Soviet Union because, if NATO refused, then it would confirm what everyone knew, which is that this was an anti-Soviet alliance, that it wasn't just a defensive alliance, that it actually was something which could potentially threaten the Soviet Union, right? However, if they allowed them to join, then NATO would become completely pointless, and the Soviet Union would be able to basically destabilize it from within. So NATO refused to allow the Soviet Union to join it, and as a result, the following year, in 1955, the Warsaw Pact was set up. So this is the Soviet Union and all the different satellite states which it had. So fast forward now towards the end of the Cold War, right? So you've had the fall of the Berlin Wall. You've had different countries begin to want to leave the Warsaw Pact, right? And around this time, so in February of 1990, Gorbachev met with Secretary of State James Baker, and Gorbachev kind of made the point of okay, you say that NATO is not directly against us. That is simply a security structure that is adapting to new realities. Therefore, we propose to join NATO. Now, Secretary of State James Baker, his response to this was basically to dismiss it. He said, this is a dream. And bearing in mind, obviously, what we said with what Molotov had done in 1954, you'd be forgiven for kind of thinking along the same kind of lines, because you'd be like, well, actually, yes, you're liberalizing a little bit. Yes, you're allowing different countries to leave. Yes, you're not the big, scary, Soviet Union that you once were. At the same time, you're still the Soviet Union, right? You're still communist, and you still have countries which are within your sphere of influence, right? So it still is a thing where the Cold War on paper has ended, but in the 1970s, we thought that the Cold War had ended, right? And actually, you guys just came back with the invasion of Afghanistan and with all other things, right? So we don't really trust you still, right? So just, so with the collapse of the Soviet Union, so first of all, in July of 1991, the Warsaw Pact formally disbanded, right? The few countries which were left, they was like, right, we had a big meeting and they all decided that we were going to pull out. And then in December of 1991, the Soviet Union itself completely collapsed, right? Completely dissolved. And so you had Russia and 14 other former Soviet republics, which were all now independent states. So with that being the case now, there is no more Cold War, there's no more Soviet Union, there's no more communism. So now what's the point of NATO, right? At this point now, you could make a very strong argument to completely disband NATO. At the same time, because obviously the situation was quite fluid, lots of things happening in a very short amount of time, from NATO's perspective, they were like, okay, let's just keep together, just because we don't know necessarily what's going to happen, we don't know how Russia's going to turn out, etc., right? But throughout the 1990s, Russia was making moves to join NATO. So first of all, you had Boris Yeltsin. So he's the one who basically overthrew Gorbachev, and like he's the one who kind of facilitated the breakup of the Soviet Union. So Boris Yeltsin, throughout his time as the president of Russia, he said that NATO membership was a long-term political aim, right? So this is something which, Russia is aiming towards, wants to join NATO, right? And this is something that we have to really kind of bear in mind, that in the 1990s, so Russia looked like it wanted to join. And even the US president, President Clinton, in those early days, he seemed to be quite open to the idea of Russia being able to join. So in 1994, there's a so-called Partnership for Peace, in which Clinton makes this point. So he says that the Partnership for Peace is a track that will lead to NATO membership. Russia is not a near-term threat, and that he also did not intend to draw another line dividing Europe a few hundred miles to the east. And he said that the reaction in Russia could be the reverse of what we want. So what Bill Clinton understood was that allowing these other states, which had been part of the Warsaw Pact, so Poland and all these other countries, right, allowing them to join without also allowing Russia to join would be counterproductive. He understood that this would push Russia further away from the West, and that it would, really antagonize the Russians, which is like opposite of what they wanted in those days. However, something to kind of note is this, right, which is the lessons of World War I and World War II were completely missed by the people who were leading America in this kind of post-Cold War era, right? So the lessons of World War I was that, you had the Treaty of Versailles, which was a bad peace. And if you have a bad peace settlement, you are basically leading the way to the next war. So the Treaty of Versailles has paved the way to World War II. But after World War II, American leaders had learnt the lessons from the Treaty of Versailles. And so what they decided to do was the Marshall Plan, right? So the Marshall Plan gave $13 billion in today's money to West Germany to help it to rebuild. It wasn't just giving them this money, right? With that, it was basically a loan, so there were things attached to it. So it required the restructuring of Germany's political institutions, its economic institutions, and its societal institutions. So Germany now was going to be rebuilt in a Western model, and it was going to become part of the liberal, democratic, capitalist West, right? And a very similar thing was done with Japan as well with regard to its rebuilding. So this was the lesson which was learned at the end of World War II, which was that when you have defeated a country, the way to make sure that that country doesn't try and come back is by, offering the hand of friendship, helping them to rebuild, and welcoming them in the family of your fellow countries, right? However, with the Soviet Union collapsing, that wasn't done, right? So the people who were leading America at that time, especially under the first Bush presidency, so these are basically the neocons. Many of these people end up being involved in Bush Jr.'s administration as well. So these people here were pushing for something known as the Project for American Century or something like that, right? So what they wanted was US global hegemony, which we've done a video on, right? Definitely check that out. So they saw America now entering a unipolar world, right? So, and America was going to be the head of this unipolar world. So this was a way in which America could basically impose its values and impose its systems across the entire world. And they said that there ought to be no country ever to be able to rise up to the point of being a superpower which can challenge American hegemony, right? So, Russia is fallen now, let's kick it while it's down, and that's basically what they wanted, right? They didn't want to rebuild Russia. They didn't want to kind of restructure it in a way that would have actually helped them and stuff. They didn't want to offer huge loans to them and stuff, right? Instead, what they wanted them to do was to collapse and to continue to collapse. And, they wanted Russia ideally to break up into multiple different parts. So for instance, in Chechnya, for instance, they were very happy for that to go down. And, so for them, they wanted Russia to pay the price of 40 years of Cold War tensions, right? So what ended up happening to Russia as a result of this was that the oligarchs end up taking control. So the way that politicians and political elites kind of operate in the West, politicians in the West are much more likely to be funded by business people, right? The business people are more likely to fund them, and then the politicians kind of do their bidding, right? However, in societies like Russia, what it was under the Tsars, what it's been for centuries, right, is the system whereby the politicians they are the ones who are in control of the business people, right? So the politicians give these people a lot of money, a lot of power and stuff, right? But it's at the behest of the state. And therefore, any oligarch who moves even slightly outside of what Putin or whatever leader wants, those people just get taken out. So Putin was able to consolidate his power through these oligarchs, right? So through control of these oligarchs, he basically was able to control Russia. And the level of inequality in Russia really shot up, right? So what ended up happening with the oligarchs is, there's all that the state companies, within the Soviet Union, the workers were given shares, but these shares were very much undervalued and stuff. So what ended up happening was that these oligarchs, who had previously been running these different state-owned companies, they bought up all these shares and then were able to sell kind of the gas, the oil, all these kind of things at world prices, and were able to make an absolute fortune, right? And this ended up leading to a very unequal Russian society, and this basically perpetuated Russia's kind of its authoritarianism. So whereas countries like Poland were able to liberalize after the collapse of communism, Russia basically kind of retained this same kind of authoritarian structure with a few sprinklings of market liberalization and a political liberalization, right? So we missed a real trick there, right? Because this is something which Vladimir Pozner, who was a former KGB agent and stuff, he worked for Soviet propaganda, but he's changed his beliefs and stuff, and he's trying to undo all of his previous life work and stuff, right, through giving these kind of talks. But this is the point that he made, was that what should have happened after the Cold War was that there should have been another Marshall Plan. Russian society, Russian economy, Russian political institutions should have been reorganized, and then Russia would have been welcomed within the Western community, and it would have basically seen itself as a fellow Western country, which didn't end up happening. And so now we have the rise of Putin, right? So he becomes the president in 1999/2000, and in a state visit to Moscow, Bill Clinton and him end up having a conversation, and Putin has said that in that conversation, he said that it was Russia's intention to want to join NATO, right? There was a possibility that they'd want to join NATO. So this has also been backed up, because obviously, you could take Putin and be like, oh, well, maybe he just made this up, right? But even the General Secretary of NATO from 2009 to 2014, this is General Secretary Rasmussen, I think I pronounced his name correctly, he even confirmed this as well, basically saying that, Russia was on path to join NATO and that they wanted to join NATO. Putin wanted to join NATO. So this whole mess which we're seeing at the moment with regard to Ukraine and everything, right, has to be understood within this context, that there were multiple opportunities for Russia to join NATO, and yet it wasn't allowed to join NATO. And actually, even one of Putin's very close advisors, Sergei Karagov, I think I pronounced his name correctly, hopefully, he said this quote, right? "Not allowing Russia to join NATO was one of the worst mistakes in political history. It automatically put Russia and the West on a collision course, eventually sacrificing Ukraine." So the problem with what we're seeing at the moment, with regard to Ukraine joining NATO, etc., right, is if Russia is kept out of NATO and every other country in Eastern Europe is allowed to join, including Ukraine, including Georgia, right? If all these countries are allowed to join it and Russia's not allowed, then that means that, it's clearly an anti-Russian alliance. And so Russia would then be very foolish to allow such an alliance to expand, right up to its western border. So that's why you're seeing, rightly or wrongly, that's why you're seeing what you're seeing in Ukraine at the moment. Because much in the same way as if the Cold War had gone differently and, the Warsaw Pact was trying to have Soviet troops in Ireland or Soviet troops in Mexico or in Canada, etc., Britain and America would not tolerate this, right? So that's the way to kind of think about this, right? So in the same way, if you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, when there was Soviet missiles 90 miles away from America's shores, Kennedy almost started World War III for that. So one can now understand why Putin, in a similar way, is threatening potential for nuclear war over what's going on in Ukraine. So we're going to kind of go through what might have happened, like how the world would be different and stuff, right? But before we do that, obviously, we have to kind of say the caveat, which we always say, is this would never have happened. And the reason it would never have happened is actually much more kind of deep rooted, than many of our other kind of alternative histories. So what we have to understand is the phenomenon of Russophobia, right? So going all the way back to at least the 19th century, Russia has always been seen as the bogeyman, right? It's always been seen as this kind of evil, half European, half Asiatic, kind of like basically it's kind of it's been viewed in very racist terms, right? As not really part of the European family, as being a nation of brutes, a nation of, filled with Asiatic hordes, a country which doesn't operate in the same way as other European countries, which can't be treated as other Europeans, right? Has to be kept out in the cold. And you can see this in the 19th century. Whenever there's any kind of flare up here with Russia doing anything, right? Even though Europeans were carving up the whole rest of the world and stuff, right? When Russia did similar things, Russia was condemned for it, right? It's obviously accused of like whataboutery, but the fact is that to point out something may be accused as being whataboutery, but it still doesn't change from the fact of the West does bad things, Russia also does bad things, right? The only difference being that the West pretends that it doesn't do bad things and just focuses on the bad that other people are doing. Whereas the Russians understand how power politics works and they just go, well, we have our sphere of influence, you have your sphere of influence. So going all the way back to the 19th century when you had the Great Game, for instance, right? Russia was expanding into Central Asia, and the British were expanding up through India into Pakistan, into, they were trying to take Afghanistan, right? So for the Russians, they were expanding because it was in their backyard, and they wanted to expand into those places. They didn't really have much of a need for it, but it's just for prestige and for clout and stuff, right? And the British, it didn't really factor in for them that, the British are coming up from India and stuff. They weren't really that fast. But if you look at how the British viewed it, they saw it as an existential crisis. They're like, look, the Russians are coming here. The Russians are going to try and like invade India and stuff, despite how far stretched it would be, despite how almost impossible it would be, for the Russian army to be able to march down through Central Asia and take India, right? Still, the British had this paranoia about the Russians. And, fast forward now into the 20th century, right? Obviously, the Americans, until the Cold War, had no real reason to be hostile to the Russians, right? But you've had, with the Cold War, you had 40 years of anti-Russian propaganda pumped into American people, right? So it's a situation whereby one has to look at it in terms of, most of our leaders who are about nowadays, right, grew up within the Cold War. We have very old leaders who still have this Cold War mentality of Russia, big bad, right? Even though Russia's economy is smaller than that of Italy's, still this anti-Russian sentiment is still felt. Still this Russophobia is still felt. And that's kind of what we're seeing a manifestation of today, which is still just a thing of Russia is evil. It's uniquely evil in the world, and it has to be uniquely dealt with in a way which we wouldn't deal with other countries, right? China being kicked out of the SWIFT system, that's never going to happen. Saudi Arabia getting kicked out of it, that's never going to happen, right? But Russia, they are different, right? How we deal with them is completely different. But still, in spite of this kind of thing of this would never have happened, we can still theorize and still think about how the world in the last 30 years might have been different if they'd been allowed to join. So first of all, obviously we were to talk about with the Marshall Plan, for instance, if there had been a new Marshall Plan, you'd have seen a much more liberal, much more westernized, much less kind of politically and economically unequal society in Russia. And this would have meant that Russia would have seen itself far more as part of a kind of Western liberal kind of tradition. And as we kind of said in other videos before, Russia has, its symbol is the two-headed eagle, one looking west, one looking east. When the West pushed them away, they end up looking more towards China. So that's why you're seeing Russia looking more towards China and having defensive blocks with them. However, if they were part of NATO, they would be part of the West, right? And so they would be moved further away from that Chinese axis, right? And also as well, if you're a combined NATO, right, with Russia, its military budget will be $1.1 trillion, right? So this is by far and away the largest military force in the world, and it would have 4.2 million troops, right? Although something to note, obviously, is many of these troops who are in like Eastern Europe, for instance, right, in Poland, etc., many of these troops and many of these countries spend as much as they do on defense because of this fear of Russia. However, if Russia was part of the NATO alliance, then many of these countries would be a bit more chilled out and probably spend less on defense and probably have less troops. That's something to kind of like bear in mind as well when we kind of factor these things in. But also, what we're seeing now with Ukraine probably wouldn't be manifesting as it is now, because if Russia had been able to join NATO, then there would be no problem with Ukraine and Georgia also joining NATO, right? So this would mean that everything which we're seeing at the moment wouldn't have happened. Now, you can make the argument of like, oh, you know, you can't trust the Russians, they're uniquely bad and stuff, right? They're going to come in and destabilize the NATO. So two things with that. First of all, there's the old saying that they have in Godfather, which is keep your friends close and your enemies closer, right? So by them being part of NATO, yes, the Russians might be able to be sneaky and find some intelligence, etc., but also by them being part of NATO, we'd also be able to like look both ways, right? So that we'd be able to look into them and they'd be able to look into us, etc., but also from working with each other, the bonds of trust would be kind of more like strongly kind of cemented and stuff, and the distrust would kind of like dissipate over time, right? And also this other point as well is that, you know, Turkey is a member of NATO, right? So all the things you can say about Russia, about, you know, it's Eurasian, it's not necessarily European, you know, it's dictatorial, it's authoritarian, it like locks people up, it doesn't respect the rule of law, don't respect human rights, etc. It engages in aggressive military campaigns like kind of other places. All these things Turkey does, right? And yet we still allow Turkey to be part of NATO, right? And also, what you have to understand in terms of the requirements for NATO, right? It was only laid out in 1999 what those requirements were, right? So with the membership action plan, the so-called MAP, with that it said that, you know, countries had to respect the rule of law and had to respect human rights, etc. But prior to that, you know, Greece in the 60s and 70s was under a military dictatorship. Turkey today has had multiple different military coups, etc. You know, so if you can allow these countries to join NATO, why can't you allow Russia? So that's the big question, right? So with this video, let me know your thoughts in terms of, do you think that, you know, Russia could ever have joined? What do you think the effects of it joining could have been? Do you think it's a good idea? Do you think it's a bad idea, etc.? How do you think that it would have affected like what's going on currently? And yeah, so the next video we're going to do, it was going to be on the Stuarts, but this situation in Ukraine, so many different things are moving so quickly. And so the next video is going to be the kind of million-dollar question, which a lot of people are theorizing at the moment, but haven't really come to a conclusion of, which is, what happens if, you know, Russia loses this war and Putin is overthrown? So that's what the video for next week's going to be. So we're going to be looking at Russian history in terms of looking at leaders that have been overthrown, what's happened like kind of after they've lost like major wars, and that's what we're going to be looking into, right? So definitely stay tuned for that, and also don't forget to hit the bell button as well when you subscribe. You know, that will make sure that like you don't end up missing that video, and like the video as well, because that will kind of boost the algorithm and get so more people can see. And also, like we said, sharing is caring. And yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I have to say. So in the meantime, have a great day and bye.